let me start again. So I'm listening to Murray's teaching on Joshua, and he made some interesting connections that we did not get that I thought I would share with you guys. So going back to chapter 4, just a couple things. When it says armed, that means 5 men wide, and there were 40,000 of them. I don't know if anybody else picked up on that or not.
What was that, Chrissy?
Okay, so when it says the word armed,
Okay.
it means they were 5 men wide, and there was 40,000 men.
How do you spell armed?
A-R-M-E-D.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
Me too, Kim.
And if you recall, Gad, Reuben, and Manasseh, they were already settled in. They were where they were supposed to be, but he was sending them to help get the other tribes settled into their territories, which were still being were still being lived in by like the Canaanites and I have it written down.
Chrissy, to go back to the armed,
Yes.
that means there were 8,000 rows of them.
Wow.
You said 5 men wide.
Yeah, 40,000.
Can you imagine 8,000 rows of troops coming towards you?
Wow.
I wonder how they came up with that.
Well, that's it. Like he also said something else that I haven't connected yet, but I've heard him say it several times, so I know it's somewhere, but I haven't. It's on the shelf in my head. Gilgal, the word in 419, Gilgal means wheel rolling. W-H-E-E-L, rolling. Which is important in a minute. We missed this. I missed it. Maybe you guys didn't. Then remember we talked about the 10th day of the first month.
Yes.
We were kind of talking about that, like that's odd. Like what, we felt like there was some sort of connection there, but we didn't know what it was, and we were trying to figure out there was a date, I think March something Kim said out of her Bible. The 10th day, okay, so if someone turn to Exodus 12:3. I thought this was really interesting.
I have it.
Go ahead.
Let me put my glasses on here. 12:3. Annually, on the 10th day of this month, announce this to all the people of Israel. Each family shall get a lamb, or if a family is small, let it share the lamb with another small family in the neighborhood. Whether to share, yeah.
Okay, so that was the 10th day. It's the same time, right? This is 40 years later to the day that he's talking about this 10th day in Joshua. And he's saying then they had to pick the lamb for the post. They had 4 days to pick. And he's saying now we also have the same job of picking the right lamb, which is Jesus. I thought that was an interesting connection.
Well, were they to sacrifice the lamb or eat it?
Yes, they sacrificed, and then for Passover, they put it on the doorpost.
Yes.
So the death angel would come over them, and he said, we have the same choice now. We have to pick the right lamb to avoid the death angel, which is Satan.
Where's that verse that he's telling us to pick the right lamb?
It says, well, I have 4:19, so it would be around it's in chapter 4. Joshua, it's about the 10th day after the spring equinox. He said that that 10th day in the first month was the 10th day after the spring equinox, which is how they decided their festivals, remember?
Okay.
So exactly 40 years was Exodus 12:3. So it's 40 years later. And the number 40 means probation. So for the Israelites, it was the desert. So he was saying their 40 years of probation was over. So then if you go to, is everybody ready for me to move on? I'm reading, so I'm going quicker. 5:1, chapter 5, verse 1. Let me just read that real quick. It says, as soon as all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the people of Israel until they had crossed over, their hearts melted, and there was no longer any spirit in them because of the people of Israel. Now, go back to, can someone look up Deuteronomy 2:25?
I have it.
Go ahead.
Today I will begin to put the fear and dread of you on the peoples everywhere under heaven. They will hear the report about you, tremble and be in anguish because of you.
Yeah. So that he was working back then to prepare 40 years later for this entrance for them. So the king of the Canaanites and the kings of the Amorites. In Deuteronomy 2:25, God said what he was doing. And he pointed out multiple times it was God doing it and giving it to them. It was not anything that they were doing. And I thought, that's true. Like we forget, like we think we're doing something, but it's really God doing it and giving it to us.
Amen.
This was interesting because I have heard him say this several times and never really caught it. That the 10 lost tribes went to the Caucasus Mountains. They went over the Caucasus Mountains. They became Caucasians, and they migrated into Canada and to the Americas. Remember, we were talking about that, I think, on Wednesday, about how they came, our country's so blessed.
They went where?
They went over the Caucasus Mountains.
Spell that.
They became Caucasians, migrating to Canada and the Americas.
Where's that from?
I don't know. I didn't write that down. I'm going to look up the Caucasus Mountains and see where that's at.
But does that correspond with Joshua chapter 5?
5:1.
Oh,
Or
okay.
1 or 2, because then I go on to verse 3.
Can you spell the mountains?
I spelled them the way I thought it was. Caucus is what I wrote down, but I didn't check it yet.
And that's the mountain after the Jordan River?
I don't know. I have to look it up. He's just saying, like, when the 10 lost tribes, when they spread and they became lost, that's what happened. They came over the Caucasus Mountains, became Caucasians. Just like Esau's people became Russians. They're the country of Russia.
You said the 10 lost tribes?
Yeah, so that would be Israel. When we were in Isaiah, you had Judah, which had 2 tribes, and you had Israel, which had the other 10 tribes.
Yeah.
The 10 tribes became the lost tribes because they were dissipated. And I thought this was interesting too. I think I'm just hearing it another way, but like when they were talking about the sacrifices, it said the blood rituals ended with Jesus. I never really thought about that. I mean, I knew that, but thinking about it, it was more impactful hearing it like that.
It did what? It ended what?
Ended with Jesus. The
Oh,
blood
okay.
rituals ended with Jesus. And then in verse 9, chapter 5, verse 9, remember Gilgal meant the wheel rolling. In verse 9, it says, rolled away the reproach. Remember, we talked about that, how we were like, was that meaning like their slavery? Gilgal means rolled away. And is there a number 4 in there? Let me look at this a second.
Mine says Gilgal, meaning to end.
Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. So the name of that place is called Gilgal till this day. He has the number 4 here. I'm not sure where he got it. I'm looking here. Somewhere here he's connected the number 4. And he said the number 4 means earth. Number 4 means earth, which means north, south, east, west, and it means spring, summer, fall, winter. Oh, okay. The 4 days to pick the lamb. Somewhere it's about the 4 days to pick the lamb. I don't have that marked like where he said. And that's where he said you better pick the right lamb. You also have that choice. Tell me when you're ready. All right, moving on to these 12 stones, which remember we've talked about the stone of scone, and like there's some significance to these stones that we're just like not grasping. I thought this was interesting. He says in Revelation 2:17, which ladies, we've been there, we've studied this, but here we go again. Let me just get there. 2:17. Um, 2:17. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna. So manna was the angel's food that was fed to them in the desert, right? I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone with a new name on the stone that no one knows except for the one who receives it. Well, that seems like a riddle, but he's saying that they had 12 stones here in Joshua, but they got down to one stone, which is Christ. And you know how like someone who doesn't believe in him, like they just aren't called or they don't have an understanding of who he is. The ones who overcome have an understanding of who he is. And the manna that Christ gives you is his word for your mind. I thought that was very cool.
Say that again, please.
Yes. So there was the 12 stones in Joshua. In Revelation, they're down to one stone, and it's Christ. And unless God has called you, unless you have a relationship with him, you don't know the name. Like you won't know. And the manna is his word for your mind. It's the hidden manna. Like when you love him, when you seek him, when you want to know him, he will reveal the hidden manna.
I had made a note in my Bible back when we did Revelation that hidden manna was spiritual bread.
Yeah. Why did that not stick? I don't know. For me, like I was like, oh. It was interesting to me the connections he was making between Joshua. We have more. Joshua and Revelation. Are we ready to go on to the next one? Jericho, the word Jericho means fragrance.
Fragrant.
Fragrance. Yeah, like the odor. And then we are to chapter 6, but I want to go ahead and just tell you what he said about so far. That way, as we're reading it, like it'll click for you.
What's the reference for that Jericho means?
6:1.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Again, he says they weren't taking it. God was giving it to them. Just like when we get to heaven, we're not taking it. God's giving it to us. So he talks about these 6 days. He said these 6 days where they march around 6 days is dispensation of time for us now. So you have a total of 6,000 years. 6 days is 6,000 years. So you have 4,000 years before Christ and 2,000 years after Christ. Again, we are in, I don't know if I shared with you about the teaching of the fig tree, but we are in the last dispensation because in 1948, when Israel got their land back, that was the shoot of the fig tree. So we're in that time. In the 6th trump in Revelation is when the Antichrist appears. So they go around Jericho 6 times. And then the 7th day, what happens? they enter Jericho. Well, in Revelation, in the seventh trump, Jesus appears and we enter heaven, or we enter his kingdom. So it says the seven priests are symbolic of God's elect. He has this number 7,000 that I've heard him talk about multiple times. I haven't figured out where he's getting it from yet, but he's saying God's elect is 7,000. So it's on the shelf in my head. I'm waiting for a connection. He said the seven trumpets, the seven ram horns, that this is actually, Joshua's actually prophecy. It's like a double, it's like what's happening to them then, but it's also explanation for us. On the seventh trump, Christ returns, we enter the promised land. And that's all the further I got this morning. Need me to repeat anything?
The 6 days, 6,000 years. What was that?
So for every day is 1,000 years. So for 6 days, they went around Jericho. God told them to go around Jericho. For us, it's the 6,000 years. We also basically are going around Jericho waiting for our entry into the promised land. So it's 4,000 years before Christ came and then 2,000 years after. And then connected to Revelation on that seventh trump, when they blow the trumpet, they enter Jericho. For us on the seventh trump is when Jesus Christ appears and we get to enter the kingdom with him. I thought that was really interesting connections.
Is the kingdom heaven?
Well, it would be the
Or
millennial
is that the
reign.
millennial reign?
Yeah, it would
Okay.
be the millennial reign because Jesus rules in the millennial reign too. It's just we still have evil people with us during that time.
During the seventh, at the seventh trump, you're
In the
saying,
millennial reign.
is the
Because
millennial.
then Satan's bound, and there's no reason why we should be evil, but yet it shows that the evilness comes from within us, and there will still be people who don't go with the Lord, like they get every last chance possible. And so after the 1,000-year millennial reign is when the white throne judgment happens.
So when this is all going on with, excuse me, directions, instructions to Joshua, obviously he's applying it to that particular time.
Yeah.
Does he have any idea, like, okay, this is much bigger than what you're doing right now?
Mm-hmm.
Probably not, but
I bet not. But there is a verse, I'd have to go back to my notes and look it up, that he put that the Lord said we have all the information we need in the prophets. So where we think we don't need to study the Old Testament, or you know what I mean? Like we seriously need to study the Old Testament because all the information's there in the prophets. Anyway, so I'm on chapter 6 with him, so that he goes through about a chapter a day. So I'll have information for the rest of chapter 6 tomorrow. Not tomorrow, Monday.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions on that? I thought they were cool connections.
Maybe we can repeat that on Monday.
Okay.
I'm joking.
All right, we're in chapter 6 today. Kim, I don't know if you heard Janet said she wanted to thank you for having us reread Worsby because we got so much more out of it the second time.
Okay. I'm glad everybody got as much out of it as I did that second time around. That was very, very good.
I feel like, you know, when I study the word, I feel like I don't know if you guys feel this way or not. Like I feel like I'm in that book and I'm really focused on that book. And sometimes I'll connect it to other things, but I don't think that I'm thinking full enough when we read something. Because like when he makes these connections, I'm like, well, why didn't I think about the Trump? So like every time you see a number. So I got to thinking like, okay, so they got their land back May 14th of 1948. So you have 48, 58, 68, 78, 48, 58, 68.
78.
I was thinking 88. for some reason. 48, 58, 68, 78, 88. That would be 40 years, right?
Yes.
So 40 years, I want to look and see what happened in 88 that might have been significant. And maybe we didn't see it. Maybe it was hidden. I don't know if you guys watched the podcast that I texted you from Candace, but super interesting. So then if you go from 88, you have 98, 2008, 2018, 2028 would be another 40 years. And if you're 40 days to the day on this, I wonder if something significant will happen around May 14th of 28. I don't know, something to put on the shelf. All right. Who would like to start reading chapter 6? We can popcorn it. It's pretty long.
I don't mind reading.
Thank you.
Now Jericho was strongly fortified because of the Israelites, no one leaving or entering. The Lord said to Joshua, "Look, I have handed Jericho, its king, and its best soldiers over to you. March around the city with all the men of war, circling the city one time. Do this for 6 days. Having 7 priests carry 7 ram's horn trumpets in front of the ark. But on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times while the priests blow the ram's horns. When there is a prolonged blast of the horn and you hear its sound, have all the troops give a mighty shout. Then the city wall will collapse and the troops will advance, each man straight ahead." So Joshua, son of Nun, summoned the priests and said to them, Take up the ark of the covenant and have 7 priests carry 7 ram's horns in front of the ark of the Lord. He said to the troops, "Move forward, march around the city, and have the armed men go ahead of the ark of the Lord." After Joshua had spoken to the troops, 7 priests carrying 7 ram's horns before the Lord moved forward and blew the ram's horns. The ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. While the ram's horns were blowing, the armed men went in front of the priests who blew the ram's horns, and the rear guard went behind the ark. But Joshua had commanded the troops, "Do not shout or let your voice be heard. Don't let one word come out of your mouth until the time I say shout. Then you are to shout." So the ark of the Lord was carried around the city, circling it once. They returned to the camp and spent the night there. Joshua got up early the next morning. The priests took the ark of the Lord, and the 7 priests carrying 7 ram's horns marched in front of the ark of the Lord. While the ram's horns were blowing, the armed men went in front of them, and the rear guard went behind the ark of the Lord. On the 2nd day, they marched around the city once and returned to camp. They did this for 6 days. Early on the 7th day, they started at dawn and marched around the city 7 times in the same way. That was the only day they marched around the city 7 times. After the 7th time, the priests blew the ram's horns, and Joshua said to the troops, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." But the city and everything in it are set apart to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and everyone with her in the house will live, because she hid the messengers we sent. But keep yourselves from the things set apart, or you will be set apart for destruction. If you take any of those things, you will set apart the camp of Israel for destruction and make trouble for it. For all the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron are dedicated to the Lord and must go into the Lord's treasury. So the troops shouted, and the ram's horn sounded. When they heard the blast of the ram's horn, the troops gave a great shout, and the wall collapsed. The troops advanced into the city, each man straight ahead, and they captured the city. They completely destroyed everything in the city with the sword, every man and woman, both young and old, and every ox, sheep, and donkey. Joshua said to the 2 men who had scouted the land, "Go to the prostitute's house and bring the woman out here." Nope. Go to the prostitute's house and bring the woman out of there, and all who are with her, just as you swore to her. So the young men who had scouted went in and brought out Rahab and her father, mother, brothers, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her whole family and settled them outside the camp of Israel. They burned the city and everything in it, but they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. However, Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute, her father's family, and all who belonged to her, because he hid the messengers Joshua had sent to spy on Jericho, and she still lives in Israel today. At that time, Joshua imposed this curse: the man who undertakes the rebuilding of this city, Jericho, is cursed before the Lord. He will lay its foundation at the cost of his firstborn. He will finish its gates at the cost of his youngest. And the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land.
Well, that's an interesting curse. It's their land. They're taking it. So who is he cursing? And I wonder who actually did it.
Was it still called Jericho though?
At the time,
Well, this is the promised land, so it would be Jerusalem, right? I guess we'll find out. Because it was like Canaan at the time. Well, you know what, though? It would have been a wider spread of land because Jerusalem and Judah are just two parts inside that map of what all of it that belongs to them. All right, Cindy, whenever you're ready.
Oh, hey, just a note at the bottom, a footnote I have for 6:26. This curse was fulfilled in First Kings 16:34, when a man rebuilt Jericho and consequently lost his oldest and youngest sons.
1634.
First Kings 16:34.
You want me
I'm
to read
sorry,
it?
can you repeat that one more time? First Kings.
16:34.
Thank you.
Yeah.
First Kings 16:34 says, in his days, Hiel, Hiel of Bethel, built Jericho. He laid its foundations at the cost of Abiram, Abiram, his firstborn, and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Joshua, the son of Nun.
I wonder if he knew that when he was building it.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
well, in mine, after what Caitlin said, mine says some believe that Hiel actually sacrificed his sons and placed them in the foundation and gate masonry to ward off evil.
Oh, that would make sense to why he said, and set up its gates at the cost. Where did you say that it said it? History says that, or where did you say it came from?
Some believe.
Okay. Maybe our commentaries will give us more.
Yeah, I just have a short thing. You know, I have the Jesus Bible
Yeah.
referring to the scarlet robe that Rahab hung, tied to the wooden window frame, symbolizes other scenes of God's salvation to Scripture. While in Egypt, the Israelites must wipe red blood on the wooden doorpost, marking the houses, so that the angel of death would pass over them. And one day, Rahab's descendant would be mocked and beaten while wearing a scarlet robe. He would bleed red blood on the wooden cross in a once-for-all moment of sacrifice for our redemption. Through the scarlet robe of Jesus' atoning death, he marks us for salvation. That was just something they put in there.
Yeah, it's nice connection.
Well, John doesn't have much. You know, John hasn't had a whole lot these past couple of days.
Maybe he wasn't feeling well those couple of days.
Well, I'm beginning to wonder. Okay, 6-1. The central campaign, Jericho. The city was fortified by a double ring of walls, the outer 6 feet thick and the inner 12 feet thick.
Oh, 2 walls,
2 walls, outer 6 feet thick, inner 12 feet thick.
outer 6 feet thick, inner
12 feet.
12 feet thick.
Timbers were laid across these, supporting houses on the walls.
Hmm.
Since Jericho was built on a hill, it could be taken only by mounting a steep incline, which put the Israelites at a great disadvantage. Attackers of such a fortress often used a siege of several months to force surrender through starvation. 6-3-21. The bizarre military strategy of marching around Jericho gave occasion for the Israelites to take God at his promise. They would also heighten the defenders' uneasiness. 7 is sometimes a number used to signify completeness. 6-5. God assured Israel of an astounding miracle, just as he had done at the Jordan. 6:16. The loud shout in unison expressed an expectation of God's action to fulfill his guaranteed promise. 6:17. Doomed. This Hebrew term means utterly destroyed. As in verse 21, that is to ban or devote as a spoil for a deity. Here, it is required to be retained for God's possession, a tribute belonging to him for the purpose of destruction. 6:22-25. Joshua honored the promise of safety to the household of Rahab. The part of the wall securing this house must not have fallen, and all possessions in the dwelling were safe. 6:26. God put a curse on whoever would rebuild Jericho. While the area around it was later occupied to some extent, 2 Samuel 10:5, in Ahab's reign, Hiel rebuilt Jericho and experienced the curse by losing his eldest and youngest sons.
You say that
I
was
remember-
Ahab's reign?
Yes. 6:27. God kept his pledge that he would be with Joshua. That's it.
Wasn't Ahab the one that was married to Jezebel?
I think so.
That would make sense that there was a ton of evilness then happening during that time. Kathy, how's Worsby?
Very long, like 4 pages.
Oh, wow. Do you want me to read Tony first, since it's
Yeah, you can.
okay, so Tony Evans, the next chapter opens with the reminder that Jericho was strongly fortified. As Rahab had told the spies, the people of Jericho were terrified of the Israelites and their God, so the invaders drew near. The city's occupants weren't letting anyone get in or out of their defense wall of protection. But the Lord told Joshua, I have handed Jericho, its kings, and its best soldiers over to you. This meant that though the battle hadn't even occurred yet, Jericho had already lost according to God. Though it had not yet happened in history, the victory had been declared in eternity. God wanted Joshua to be assured of this because he was about to give him a battle plan that wouldn't make sense. I think it was interesting that you said about the two walls in John, because if they had got through the first wall, if they'd have got through a gate at the first wall, they would have been trapped inside that second wall, and they could have shot them and killed them from above before they got into the second wall. So it would have not made sense. It would have been very scary looking, I'm sure. Verses 3 through 5. God commanded Joshua to have 7 priests carry 7 ram's horn trumpets. They and all the men were to march around the city, one time every day for 6 days. Then on the 7th day, they were to march 7 times. After the final lap around the city, the priests were to blow the trumpets and the men were to shout. Then the wall would collapse in such a way that the invaders could go straight in and take care of business. You don't have to be asleep. You would have to be asleep not to notice the repetition of the number 7 in these verses. In Scripture, 7 is the number of completion. God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. Well, interesting connection there, right? We work for these 6,000 years and we get to rest when we get to heaven. The 7 churches of Revelation represent all the churches, although the only good ones were Smyrna and Philadelphia, and that's who we should pay attention to. As Revelation continues, the 7 seals were opened, the 7 trumpets sound, and the 7 bowls are poured out, all indicating the completion of God's work. So in these instructions, God was emphasizing to Joshua that he must follow the instructions completely if he wanted God to bring down his problem supernaturally. Don't miss that truth. Verses 6 through 25. A careful reading of 6 through 15 reveals that Joshua and the people did exactly what the Lord told them to do. We don't know what the people of Jericho thought about this 7-day parade. But Israel was faithful to obey God. On the 7th day, the priests blew the trumpets and Joshua ordered, shout, showtime. At that moment, the wall collapsed. Immediately thereafter, the troops advanced into the city, each man straight ahead. God had turned the barrier that stood in their way into a pathway, a stepping stones leading to their goal. But he didn't do it without their involvement. The author of Hebrews says, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell. That would be Hebrews 11:30. Make note on that. To be a person of faith, then, doesn't mean sitting around doing nothing. It requires acting on that faith, trusting that what God says he will do. By faith, Israel followed divine instruction and saw supernatural results. Because she was faithful in protecting God's people, Rahab the prostitute was rescued as promised along with her whole family. Many years later, the author of Hebrews would single her out for her faith in 11:31. But because the inhabitants of Jericho defied God with their wickedness, they were put to death. Oh, he's referring to, remember God said, I'm going to give you the land, not because you're so good, but because they're so bad, because they're so evil, not because you're good. But that's what he's referring to here. Deuteronomy 12 and Deuteronomy 20. They were put to death in 621. The Israelites were not to take any of the things that were set apart for this destruction. Everything of value in the city was either to be destroyed or preserved for the Lord's treasury, a prohibition that will be very important in the events of chapter 7. Dun, dun, dun. Verses 26 and 27. Joshua placed a curse on Jericho. Whoever sought to rebuild the city would do so at a cost of his own children. This prophetic curse would be fulfilled centuries later. See 1 Kings 16:34. That's the end of Tony.
Do you think we should wait till Monday to?
Well, we could start it and just take our
Okay.
time, and then we could just mark where we're stopping. Unless Kathy, you feel like it would be better to wait.
No, it has some breaks. We can
Okay.
do part of it, and I'll just try not to trip over all the words.
This little footnote's encouraging. It's on chapter 6, verse 2 through 5. It just says, God told Joshua that the enemy was already defeated. What confidence Joshua must have had as he went into battle. Christians must also fight against a defeated enemy. Our enemy, Satan, has been defeated by Christ. Although we still fight battles every day, we have the assurance that the war has already been won. We do not have to be paralyzed by the power of a defeated enemy. We can overcome temptation through the power of Christ.
This sounds like a repeat too. Like when we were in Israel, we went to Herod's. He had his like temple up on top of this mountain, and sounded very much like a battle that had happened there. Like they were building siege ramps up to it, and they ended up getting stuck inside without food because they couldn't get out to go get food and water. It's like history always repeats itself.
You ready?
Yep.
Conquest begins. You are but a poor soldier of Christ if you think you can overcome without fighting and suppose you can have the crown without conflict. The courageous Syrian preacher and martyr John Chrysostom said that, and he was right, for the Christian life involves challenge and conflict, whether we like it or not. Our enemies are constantly waging war against us and trying to keep us from claiming our inheritance in Jesus Christ. The world, the flesh, and the devil are united against Christ and his people, just as the nations in Canaan were united against Joshua and the Jewish nation. It's unfortunate that many of the militant songs of the church have been removed from some hymnals, apparently because the idea of warfare disturbs people and seems to contradict the words and works of Jesus Christ. But these zealous editors with scissors seem to have forgotten the main theme of the Bible is God's holy warfare against Satan and sin. In Genesis 3:15, God declared war on Satan, and one day he will declare the victory when Jesus comes as the conqueror to establish his kingdom. If you eliminate the militant side of the Christian faith, then you must abandon the cross, for it was on the cross that Jesus won the victory over sin and Satan. Colossians 2:13-15. A pastor attended a court hearing to protest the building of a tavern near his church and a public school. The lawyer for the tavern owner said to him, "I'm surprised to see you here today, Reverend. As a shepherd, shouldn't you be out taking care of the sheep?" The pastor replied, "Today I'm fighting the wolf." Too many Christians cultivate only a sentimental emphasis on peace and goodwill and ignore the spiritual battle against sin, and this means they're already lost the victory and are working for the enemy. We must never forget Paul's warning about the savage wolves that are ready to destroy the flock, Acts 20. The Christian's warfare is not against flesh and blood, but against enemies in the spiritual realm, Ephesians 6. And the weapons we use are spiritual, 2 Corinthians 10. Satan and his demonic armies use people to oppose and attack the church of God, and if we don't take our stand with Christ, we've already lost the battle. In the army of Jesus Christ, there can be no neutrality. He that is not with me is against me, said Jesus, and he spoke those words in the context of spiritual warfare, Matthew 12. Since the Apostle Paul often used the military image to describe the Christian life, we dare not ignore the subject.
Did it give a address in that Matthew 12?
Yeah, 24-30.
Thank you.
Israel's victory at Jericho illustrates three principles of spiritual conflict and victory applicable to our lives today, no matter what challenges we may be called to confront.
Three
Before the
principles of spiritual what?
conflict, three principles of spiritual conflict and victory applicable to our lives today. Before the challenge, remember that you fight from victory, not just for victory. This is verses 1 to 5.
1 through 5, fight from victory, not for victory.
Yes, not just for victory. You fight from victory, not just for victory.
Fight from victory, not
Just for victory.
just for victory. Okay.
The Christian soldier stands in a position of guaranteed victory because Jesus Christ has already defeated every spiritual enemy. John 12:31. Jesus defeated Satan not only in the wilderness, Matthew 4, but also during his early ministry, Matthew 12, I think that would be, and on the cross, Colossians 2, and in his resurrection and ascension, Ephesians 1. As he intercedes for his people in heaven, he helps us mature and accomplish his will. And if God be for us, who can be against us? Romans 8:31. Consider the factors involved in Joshua's victory. This is verse 1, the fear of the Lord. This would be one of the factors. The land of Canaan was divided up among a number of city-states, each ruled by a king. These cities were not large. Ai, that is, which was smaller than Jericho, had about 12,000 people. Excavations at Jericho indicate that the city covered perhaps 8 acres and was protected by 2 high parallel walls, which stood about 15 feet apart and surrounded the city. It was the site of the cities, like Jericho, that convinced 10 of the Jewish spies that Israel could never conquer the land. That's found in Numbers. But the news of Israel's exodus from Egypt and their recent victories east of the Jordan had already spread to Canaan and put the people in panic. And there are references to Joshua and Deuteronomy. I will send my fear before you, God had promised. I will cause confusion among all the people to whom you come, and will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. Exodus 23. It was said that Mary, Queen of Scots, feared John Knox's prayers more than she feared an enemy army. But is society today afraid of what God's people may do? Probably not. And it's mainly because the church hasn't done very much to display the power of God to a skeptical world. The church is no longer terrible as an army with banners. In fact, the church is so much like the world that the world takes little notice of what we do. We imitate the world's methods, we cater to the world's appetites, we solicit the world's approval, and we measure what we do according to the world's standards. Is it any wonder that we don't gain the world's respect? But not so with Joshua and Israel. They were a conquering people who made no compromise with the enemy, but trusted God to give them victory. Theirs was a march of triumph that put the fear of God into the hearts of the enemy. Let's see what time it is. We'll do verse 2 here. The promise of the Lord. It's possible that the Lord spoke these words to Joshua when he confronted him at Jericho. The tense of the verb is important. I have given Jericho into your hand. The victory had already been won. All Joshua and his people had to do was claim the promise and obey the Lord. Victorious Christians are people who know the promises of God because they spend time meditating on God's word. They believe the promises of God because the word of God generates faith in their hearts. And they reckon on these promises and obey what God tells them to do. To reckon means to count as true in your life what God says about you in his word. Be of good cheer, Jesus told his disciples. I have overcome the world. John 16:33. And they that are Christ have crucified the flesh with the affections and lusts. Galatians 5:24. Now is the judgment of this world. Now shall the prince of this world be cast out. John 12:31. Christ has conquered the world, the flesh, and the devil. And if we reckon on this truth, we can conquer through him. It's possible to believe a promise and still not reckon on it and obey the Lord. Believing a promise is like accepting a check, but reckoning is like endorsing the check and cashing it. Want me to stop there?
What was that statement? Count as true in your life. What?
To reckon means to count as true in your life what God says about you in his word.
So it's already done.
Hmm.
You can't just I guess you can't just have the head knowledge, but you have to actually believe it and act on it as if it's true, because it is true. Yeah, that's a good place for you to stop. It's 28 after. Is that a good place for you?
Yeah, because then it goes into verse 3 to 5 then.
Wow, that was all for verses 1 and 2.
Yeah.
I like that fight from victory, not just for victory. A lot of good stuff. Any last thoughts? All right. Then this concludes the reading of God's word for today. We'll pick back up Monday with Words Beyond chapter 6. Have a good day.